What happens when the CEO who just closed a $400 million defense contract personally denied a single father's loan application 5 times over 3 years, and has no idea that the one component her entire production line cannot run without is machined in his garage? Renata Osei had signed the 5th denial letter herself 14 months ago. 2 sentences, no explanation. The paper arriving on a Tuesday morning while Elias Varga was at his lathe. She had moved on before the envelope left her building. She did not know his name. She did not know what he made. She did not know that somewhere in the supply chain beneath her flagship contract, his hands were the reason her machines ran. She would know all of it by Thursday, and she would spend a long time after that thinking about the distance between what a person can do and what a person can know. Elias Varga had been making things since he was 9 years old, when his father put a file in his hand in a workshop in Bratislava and told him that the difference between a good machinist and a great one was the ability to feel the tolerance with your fingertips before the gauge confirmed it. He had been in the garage at 4 Callaway Street for 11 years, ever since his wife Marta had helped him insulate the walls and run the electrical and hang the first piece of equipment, a used surface grinder she had found 3 counties over and driven home in the back of their truck with their daughter Petra asleep across the back seat. Marta had been gone for 5 years. The surface grinder was still running. The garage was 24 feet by 32, climate-controlled to within 2 degrees because the work required it. On the pegboard above the main bench were 3 items that told anyone who understood them everything necessary about the level of work done here. A specification sheet from an aerospace prime with ITAR controlled stamped in red across the header. A calibration certificate from a metrology lab in Dayton that cost more per visit than most shops charged for a month of production. And a single finished component in a clear acrylic case, 2 inches long, turned to a surface finish of 8 microinches raw, the kind of number that made quality engineers stop talking. Petra Varga was 8 years old and had her father's hands, the proportion of them, the steadiness, and her mother's habit of asking questions sideways. She attended school 4 blocks away at Carver Elementary, where she had recently told her science teacher that her father's most important tool was not the lathe or the measuring machine, but the temperature in the room. Because everything else depended on that first. She carried, on a loop of braided wire around her neck, a titanium hex nut her father had machined for her when she was 3. He had made it in 4 minutes, because she had sat on the shop stool and pointed at the material stock and said she wanted one. It was perfect. She had checked it herself with a gauge her father showed her how to use, and the needle had not moved. The ticking clock had arrived 6 weeks ago, a letter from First Meridian Capital informing Elias that the $78,000 equipment loan from 2021 was being called for full repayment within 22 days due to a covenant violation triggered by a routine review. The covenant was a technicality involving revenue classification. Elias had spoken to 3 different people at the bank. None could explain who had initiated the review. The 22 days were now 17. He dreaded the Thursday meeting because it was the 5th time he had sat in a room at First Meridian and asked for something reasonable, and had no cause to believe he would not receive it. The first 4 denials had come from a senior lending officer named Graham Holt. The 5th, 14 months ago, had a different signature, but the same shape. Elias had worked in manufacturing long enough to know what a specification written to exclude a specific supplier looked like. He recognized the pattern. He picked up Petra from school at 3:15. She got in the truck and said, "You're doing the face." He said, "What face?" "The one where you're running tolerances instead of being here." She pulled the nut from her collar. "Is it the bank?" he said, Thursday. She held the nut and looked out the window. Dad, is the shop going to close? He said, not if I can help it. She put the nut back inside her collar and did not say anything else. The thing she did when she had decided to trust him with something she wasn't sure about. It cost Elias more than any loan denial ever had. Renata Osei had declined to renew a $220 million supplier contract by 9 a.m. on Thursday, which meant she had restructured her company's highest-cost vendor relationship before most of her team finished their first coffee. She ran Meridian Precision Group the way her father had taught her to run anything worth running, on the principle that whoever understands the system at the component level will always outmaneuver the person who only understands it at the output. She was 41, had a mechanical engineering degree she had used daily until 6 years ago, and a strategic finance mind she had used every day since, and had grown Meridian from a $90 million regional supplier to a $400 million prime contractor in 7 years, by finding the failure points before they failed. The thing her title could not reach was a question she had carried for 6 years without an answer. Whether the decision at 35 to take Meridian's CEO position rather than run her father's firm had been right, or whether she had spent 6 years building something impressive at the cost of something irreplaceable. Her father had been a machinist, not a businessman, not a strategist, a machinist. A man who measured things and understood that the gap between what a thing was and what it needed to be was the only territory worth working in. She had taken his vocabulary and applied it to organizations, and had built something he never could have, and had never told him what it was built on. He had died in her 2nd year at Meridian. He had not seen what she built. She told herself he would have been proud. She had not been entirely certain on any of those occasions, and she had learned to stop examining the question too closely, which was a habit she recognized from his workshop as the thing a machinist did when the tolerance was too tight to hit and they were not ready to admit it yet. She was reading the supply chain audit report in the car on the way to First Meridian Capital. Her operations director had flagged an anomaly, a single-source component in the Tier 3 supply chain, bearing sleeve assembly MS7741R, listed as sourcing through a distributor called Apex Component Solutions. The audit flagged Apex as a pass-through entity, no manufacturing capability, no facility inspection record. The actual point of manufacture for MS7741R was listed in the distributor's own filings as a sole proprietorship at 4 Callaway Street. She looked at that address for a moment. Then she turned the page. She arrived at First Meridian for a board meeting with the lending committee. Graham Holt was already in the conference room. She had known him 4 years. He was the bank's chief lending officer, and had a habit of picking up objects from other people's spaces and turning them over in his hands as though tactile possession of the room were a form of authority. He had done it the first time they met, and he did it now, picking up the glass paperweight from the conference credenza and rotating it once before setting it on the wrong side of the table. He had already begun speaking when she sat down. Renata, good of you to come in person. The smile of a man who has already decided the outcome. We have a situation in a small business portfolio that intersects with Meridian's supply chain. A sole proprietor, a machinist, a covenant default. I want to make sure Meridian isn't exposed before we accelerate. She said, which supplier? He said Varga. 4 Callaway Street. She looked at him. She said nothing for a moment. He said, the component is a custom bearing sleeve. Your team sources it through Apex. We want to make sure Meridian has continuity options before we proceed. She said, how long have you known this component was single source through that address? He said, that's not really how long. He said, "A few weeks." She looked at the paperweight on the wrong side of the table. She looked at him. "I'll need to see this facility before any acceleration proceeds," she said. Today. She arrived at 4 Callaway Street at 11:14 a.m. She had her operations director and a quality engineer. Elias had been expecting Graham Holt. He had been expecting the call that ended the 17-day clock. Instead, a car pulled into the driveway, and a woman got out and stood at the edge of his open garage door and looked at the equipment the way engineers look at equipment. Not in general, but specifically, her eyes moving from the CMM to the lathe, to the surface grinder, to the calibration certificate on the pegboard in the sequence of someone who understood what she was reading. He came out from behind the machine and wiped his hands. She said, "I'm Renata Ose. I'm the CEO of Meridian Precision Group." She looked at the acrylic case on the bench. "You make MS7741R, not a question." He said, "I make MS7741R. She walked to the case and looked at the component inside without touching the case. Then she said the one thing he had not expected, "Who taught you the surface finish specification?" He said, "I wrote the specification." She looked at him, then at the component. The recalibration in her face was not subtle. "The original specification," he said. "I was lead process engineer on the MS7741 series at a defense subcontractor in Ohio, before I went out on my own. I designed the tolerance stack. I designed the surface finish requirement. When I started this shop, it was the one component I knew I could make better than anyone else, because I had built the standard it was measured against." She was still. "You designed the specification," she said. 14 years ago. The design transferred with the program when the subcontractor was acquired. I don't hold the IP. I hold the knowledge of how to make it right." She looked at the calibration certificate, the ITAR stamp, the component in its case. She said, 5 loan applications." He said, "Yes." She said, "I signed the 5th denial." He said, "I know." The space between them held that. She said, "I didn't know what you made." He said, "I know that too." She went back to her car and was on the phone for 11 minutes. Her operations director asked Elias questions about production capacity and lead time, which Elias answered with the directness of a man who does not negotiate his own precision. The quality engineer asked for the CMM calibration records and went quiet the way engineers go quiet when numbers are better than expected. When Renata returned, she said, "Graham Holt holds a beneficial interest through a nominee entity in a company called Daedalus Component Solutions. Daedalus makes a competing bearing sleeve that does not meet the MS7741R surface finish spec. My legal team found the nominee structure in a FINRA disclosure from 18 months ago." She paused. "He has been denying your applications because your shop's failure benefits his investment. A covenant default and an accelerated recall would force you to suspend production, create a supply disruption for Meridian, and position Daedalus for the emergency contract." Elias said, "The 5 denials." She said, "Were not credit decisions." He looked at the surface grinder Marta had driven 3 counties to find. His hands were still. He said, "The covenant violation. Was that him too?" "My legal team is in the review initiation record right now." He picked up a torque wrench from the bench. He set it back in its place. He said, "My wife chose this building. She said the ceiling height was right for the equipment we'd need." He looked at the ceiling. She was right. Renata said nothing for a moment. "Then, she's not here now. 5 years ago." The garage held that. A car passed on Callaway Street. The sound moved through and was gone. She said, "I'm going to fix this." He said, "You'll need the documentation. I have people who find documentation. I have the original design files. From Ohio. The ones that show I built the standard this component is measured against." He looked at her. "That might be useful." She said yes. Then, after a pause that was not planned, "It might also be useful for a different reason. Meridian is restructuring its Tier 3 supply base. Single-source components need to come under direct contract. If your shop has the capacity, with the right equipment, we want to talk about a real supply agreement, not through Apex." He said, "I've been trying to have that conversation for 3 years." She said, "I know." And she said it with the weight of someone who has just understood, at last, the cost of a door that was there the whole time and was never opened. He looked at the surface grinder against the far wall. The paint on the housing was faded where Marta had touched it most, the left side panel, the feed control, the height adjustment wheel. 5 years, and he had never repainted those sections. He didn't know, now, whether that was deliberate or whether he had simply not been able to. Both were probably true, she said, quietly. "You've been running this specification for 11 years. By yourself." He said, "The standard doesn't change because the shop is small." She looked at the ITAR stamp on the specification. She looked at the calibration certificate. She looked at the component in its case, the component that her production line depended on, that had been running through a shell distributor, that had been made in this garage by this man for 11 years without her knowing his name. She said, "I'm sorry." He said, "You didn't know." She said, "I signed the 5th denial." He said, "You didn't know what you were signing." The difference between those two things was the whole of it, and both of them understood that, and neither of them looked away from it. Petra came home at 3:30 and stopped in the driveway. An unfamiliar car, 2 unfamiliar people inside the garage. Her father at the bench with his hands in his pockets, which was what he did when something significant was happening, and he was letting it happen at its own speed. She walked in and stood beside him. The woman looked at her. Petra looked back. The woman said, "You must be Petra." Petra said, "Is this about the loan?" The woman looked at Elias, who said nothing, his way of saying, "Let her." Petra pulled the titanium nut from her collar and held it in her palm toward the woman. "This is the first perfect thing my dad ever made. He made it for me." He said perfect doesn't mean no flaws. It means the flaws are inside the tolerance. She looked at the woman. "Are you going to help? Or are you another person who sends a letter?" The woman looked at the nut in Petra's palm. She did not reach for it. She looked at it the way you look at something that says more than it means to. She said, "I'm going to help." Petra considered this for 4 full seconds, the amount of time she gave things that mattered. Then, she put the nut back inside her collar. "Okay, Gerald Hoffman in my class says banks only say yes to people who don't need the money. Are you a bank?" The woman said, "No." Petra said, "Good." She looked at the case on the bench, the acrylic case with the component inside it, the one she had grown up with the way other children grow up with a particular shelf of books, familiar and important and not requiring explanation. "He makes one of those every week," she said. "He checks it 3 times. He says checking it twice is how people who are pretty sure work. Checking it 3 times is how people who are responsible work." The woman looked at the case. She looked at Petra. She said, without thinking, the sentence escaping before she decided to say it, "Does he ever make anything just because he wants to? Not because someone ordered it?" Petra looked at her directly. "He made this," she said, and touched the nut at her collar. "Nobody ordered that." She said it the way children say things that are plainly true, and do not understand why adults sometimes need time to hear them. Renata heard it. She looked at Petra, and then at Elias, who had not turned around, and then back at Petra. And something in her face shifted in the way a fixed measurement shifts when you finally account for the variable you had been ignoring. She had been running the numbers on this situation since she walked through the garage door. She had not, until this moment, been running all of them. Petra said, "Good," and went inside to do her homework, leaving the adults in the garage with the particular silence that follows a child who has said the only thing that needed saying. Renata looked at Elias. There was something in his face that was not quite amusement, and not quite grief, and entirely familiar. The expression of someone who has arranged their whole life around a small person's certainty, and finds, in that certainty, everything they need to keep going. She said, "She's remarkable." He said, "She gets it from her mother." Plainly, without performance. Renata understood the sentence meant more than it said, and she did not ask it to mean anything else. Graham Holt arrived at 4 Calloway Street at 4:07 p.m., uninvited, having tracked Renata's car through the bank's fleet system. He walked in with his jacket on, adjusting his cuffs, once, then again his eyes doing their inventory of the room. He saw the quality engineer with a clipboard. He saw the operations director by the CMM. He saw Elias at the bench. He saw Renata. He picked up the torque wrench from the bench without asking and turned it over in his hand. "Renata, the practiced ease of a man reclaiming a room. I hope this has been productive. The bank wants to support Meridian through any supply disruption." He turned to Elias. "Mr. Varga, the bank is open to discussing a repayment plan, given your cooperation today." Elias said, "Set that down." Holt looked at the torque wrench. He set it down, not in its place. Elias picked it up and put it back. Then, the dataless interest. The nominee entity. The FINRA disclosure, 18 months ago. He looked at Holt. The covenant review initiation log from 6 weeks ago, with your name on it. The documentation establishing that every one of the 5 denial decisions was made while you held a financial interest in a competing supplier. He set his hands flat on the bench. The SEC's Market Regulation Division maintains a standing inquiry into lending officials who hold undisclosed beneficial interests in industries they oversee. My attorney filed a referral this morning. Graham Holt's hands went to his sides. He said, "The Daedalus position was fully disclosed." Elias said, "Leave." One word, at the same volume as everything else. Holt looked at Renata. She was looking at the calibration certificate on the pegboard. He looked at the quality engineer, who was writing on her clipboard and not looking up. He picked up the torque wrench again. He set it down again in the wrong place. He turned and walked to the garage door. His cuffs, adjusted twice on arrival, were not adjusted on the way out. He was simply gone, the way certainty leaves a room when it has nothing left to hold it. Not with a final statement, just a cessation of forward pressure. Petra appeared in the interior doorway. She looked at the empty garage entrance. She said, "Was that the bank?" Elias said, "That was the last of it." She said, "Good." She went back inside. Renata looked at the torque wrench sitting in the wrong place on the bench. Elias picked it up and put it back without comment. She said, "You knew he was coming." He said, "I knew something was wrong with the 5th denial. The language was too specific. Someone had written a specification to exclude me, the same way you write a manufacturing spec to exclude a supplier you want off a program. I recognize that shape." A pause. "I've been collecting documentation for 14 months. She looked at him. You waited for the right person in the room. He said, yes. The Aussie complaint was filed Monday. The supporting package was 47 pages. An examiner was assigned within 6 days. On that same Monday, Meridian's board approved an emergency direct supply agreement with Varga Precision Manufacturing at 4 Callaway Street, with retroactive pricing adjustments covering 3 years of Apex Pass through margin. The $78,000 loan balance was retired from the first installment of the advance payment. The clock, at 0 days remaining, stopped. Graham Holt received his supervisory action notice on a Wednesday. He cleared his office the same day. He did not respond to the Aussie examiner's initial request. He retained counsel and stopped returning calls. The way a man stops when he understands the operation is over, not with a statement, just the total suspension of forward motion. Renata was in the garage on the Thursday morning the loan closure confirmation arrived. She was not there for the confirmation. Her quality engineer had flagged a tolerance question on the next production run, and she had decided, for the first time in a long time, to go look at the source of the answer, rather than wait for it to come to her. She was reading the specification sheet when Petra came downstairs on the way to school. Petra stopped. She looked at Renata. She said, "You came back." Renata said, "I had a question about the tolerance stack." Petra looked at the specification. She looked at Renata. "Dad says the tolerance stack is just decisions about what you're willing to live with." She pulled the nut from her collar and looked at it. "He says perfect isn't no mistakes. It's knowing which ones don't matter." She tucked it back under her collar. "I think that's about more than machining." Renata looked at the nut disappearing back inside Petra's collar. She looked at Elias, who was at the lathe with his back to them. He had heard every word. He was not turning around. She said to Petra, "I think you're right." Petra said, "I usually am," and left for school. Renata looked at the specification in her hand. She looked at the back of Elias's head. She said, "She's going to be formidable." He said, without turning, "She already is." 8 months later. Petra Varga had received a perfect score on a state mathematics assessment and had immediately asked whether the assessment had been calibrated correctly, which her teacher reported to Elias as the most engineer-brained thing she had ever heard from a third grader. She still carried the titanium nut. She now also carried a small mechanical pencil with the Meridian Precision Group logo on the clip, which Renata had sent in September with a note, "For the person who understands that the room temperature matters most." The garage at 4 Callaway Street had 3 additional pieces of equipment, funded by the supply agreement advance. The Meridian contract was the anchor account. There were 2 others now. A medical device subcontractor and a university research lab, both sourced through referrals from Meridian's quality team. The calibration certificate on the pegboard had been updated. The acrylic case held a new component. The ITAR specification sheet had been joined by 2 others. Renata had called her mother in September, a conversation about the year and everything it had contained, and had not told Elias for 2 months. When she did, they were in the garage on a Saturday, while Petra was at a friend's house, he fitting a new collet to the lathe, she reading a specification. And she said it the way she said things now, plainly. Without the distance she had worn for so long, she had stopped noticing the weight of it. He set the collet down. He said, "How was it?" She said, "She cried." I cried. Embarrassing and right. He said, "That's usually how it goes." She looked at the specification sheet. The garage smelled like cutting fluid and cold metal, and the November that had settled into the walls. On the pegboard, The component in its acrylic case caught the light from the overhead fixture and held it. His hand came to rest on the bench beside the collet. Her hand was already there, close enough that neither of them had to decide what it meant. She looked at the surface grinder against the far wall. Old now, Marta's find. Still running. He said, "When do you know a specification is finished?" She said, "When it can't be improved without losing something else." He looked at her. She looked at the bench. Outside, November moved through, and the equipment ran at its tolerances, and the day held itself precisely inside the parameters that had been set for it, and there was nowhere either of them was going to be for a while. Some things are built once, correctly, by someone with the knowledge to know what they are building, and they run quietly, and they run true, and the people who depend on them rarely think to ask whose hands made it possible. If you know someone who has been building something true in a room no one has bothered to look inside, share this story with them. Subscribe so we can keep bringing you stories like this. And here is the question we want to leave you with tonight. If you had held the pen on someone's fifth denial, not knowing what you were really signing, would you have gone back to the source and asked? Or would you have kept moving the way institutions always do, assuming the decision was already made by someone who understood it better than you? We read every one,